Yeah. So, I mean, you're absolutely right that there is a perception, not wholly unwarranted, of lawyers out there as the people who are argumentative and combative and actually don't ever stop fighting. And there are certainly lawyers like that in movies and also in society. But the case I'm trying to make is that the best kind of lawyer is actually the lawyer that really deeply understands the other side of an argument and takes the time at a highly sophisticated level to unpack the argument, to understand where it's coming from, and at the end of the day, then to go to a judge or another decision maker and say, not, my side is right and that side is stupid, but to say, here's a really hard issue. Here's an argument from the other side that makes some sense, and here's why my argument's better.
Hello, Faithful Politics listeners. If you're joining us on our podcast feed, and watchers, if you're joining us via YouTube, it's great to see you again. This is Josh Burtram, your faithful host. And I have with us, of course, our political host, Will. It's good to see you, Will.
Yeah, thanks. Good to be seen.
Absolutely. And today we have the distinct pleasure to interview John Inazu, who is the Callie D. Danforth Distinguished Professor of Law and Religion at Washington University in St. Louis. He teaches criminal law, law and religion, and various First Amendment courses. He writes and speaks frequently about pluralism, assembly, free speech, religious freedom, and other issues. John has written 3 books and published opinion pieces in the Washington Post, Atlantic, Chicago Tribune, LA Times, USA Today, Newsweek, and CNN. He's also the founder of the Carver Project and the Legal Vocation Fellowship, and is a senior fellow with Interfaith America. And John, it is our pleasure to have you on the program. Thanks so much for joining us.
Guys, it's great to be with you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, we were kind of talking before about our shtick, which I'm kind of the token conservative, white evangelical conservative, and Will is the token liberal. Well, actually, Will is Black and Asian, so we can't just say, we got to give credit to both of the, what is it? I'm forgetting. Ethnicities. No, but I was thinking intersectionality. That was the word. I didn't forget ethnicities, Will. Don't paint me in that picture.
We have learned to disagree, Josh.
Yes, we have. But we're actually talking about John's new book, Learning to Disagree, today. And man, what an amazing title. What an awesome book. Thank you for writing it. I got to just ask, John, to start off, kind of give us maybe paint a bigger picture of who is John Inazu, and then why did you write this book, Learning to Disagree?
Yeah, thanks, guys. So I'm a law professor at WashU in St. Louis, and I do a lot of my teaching and writing around hard issues. I teach law and religion and criminal law, which raise a whole host of really complex topics. And
yes,
I write about the law of protest and free speech and free assembly. And so at the intersection of all those topics, there's just a lot of conflict and a lot of challenging ideas to negotiate in a society that doesn't agree about them. And so a few years ago, at the height of the pandemic, as we were all distanced and isolated, and I was watching all of this outrage unfold online, it occurred to me that there could be a way to capture some of these ideas in the classroom and what I write about in a way that might be helpful to people outside of law schools, right? Just trying to figure out how to do this at the Thanksgiving dinner table or the neighborhood picnic, and trying to get some tips and ideas or maybe even some models of how to do that from the perspective that I bring. And as I started the book, it ended up being basically the combination of what I do in the classroom, navigating these challenging issues, and then all the ways that I screw up my own interactions outside of the classroom, and trying to share some stories of failure and some successes along the way too. And that's what led to the book.
That's really cool. So if somebody were to pick up your book off a shelf, if they're anything like me, they'll go first to the table of contents. They'll kind of skim through, kind of see what it is. Your table of contents is organized a little bit differently. It looks more like a calendar, close to like a fiscal calendar. Now you're about like 2 months off, but like, can you explain sort of like the idea behind naming the chapters after months?
Yeah. So what I wanted to do as these ideas were coming together was present them in a narrative form that told a story. And so I built the book around essentially a year in my life of teaching, the academic calendar that runs from August to May, with each chapter tackling a different month of the year that traces the rhythms of the year from the beginning of the year to graduation. And then also that sets up a question that helps us think through disagreement maybe a little differently. So there's a topical question and a month of the year. And what I found in writing the book was that being able to trace a storyline through a calendar or an academic year allowed me to develop some characters and some themes that unfolded over the course of the book. So think of it as like part memoir, part ideas, trying to intersect a different kind of a conversation in a way that's maybe more engaging than a typical checklist sort of book.
Yeah, maybe not like the textbook where you go and you have constitutional law, section 1.
Right. Definitely not like that. The opposite of that, I hope.
The opposite of that. So, I mean, I absolutely love that setup. I think it's really creative and really cool. Obviously, being a law professor and having to teach it, having experience in court at some level, you have to learn how to disagree with people. And it's kind of an adversarial system, right? That's how our law is set up, so that we can kind of try to get to the truth through two opposing viewpoints that are kind of duking it out, so to speak. And, you think about the classic media portrayal of, being in the law court, and then the lawyer comes and he dunks on the other one with metaphorically speaking, of course, with the objection, Your Honor, and all that stuff, and the disagreement. So, you look at that and you kind of think, well, law feels like that might teach me how to fight, but not necessarily how to disagree well with the people around me. How does your experience in law help us understand? How does that teach us how to disagree and do it well?
Yeah. So, I mean, you're absolutely right that there is a perception, not wholly unwarranted, of lawyers out there as the people who are argumentative and combative and actually don't ever stop fighting. And there are certainly lawyers like that in movies and also in society. But the case I'm trying to make is that the best kind of lawyer is actually the lawyer that really deeply understands the other side of an argument and takes the time at a highly sophisticated level to unpack the argument, to understand where it's coming from. And at the end of the day, then to go to a judge or another decision maker and say, not, my side is right and that side's stupid, but to say, here's a really hard issue. Here's an argument from the other side that makes some sense, and here's why my argument's better. And that's how the best lawyers win cases, not by just arguing ad nauseum or just slamming the other side, but understanding the most charitable and best possible form of the other side. So that's one sort of entry point for law. But the other related and broader point is, even when we're arguing poorly within law is still the way that we as a society have chosen to resolve our disputes as an alternative to street violence. So yes. I'd rather have people yelling with words than choosing, overt violence. And there's a way in which law actually constrains our disagreement and discourse in some really important ways.
Now, and so in learning to disagree, just if we just take the title by itself, it implies that it's a skill that we don't have, so we actually have to learn it. So I guess maybe you can kind of talk a little bit about the title, about why do we have to learn to disagree, and then does that imply that everybody needs to learn how to disagree, or are there certain segments, certain topics, certain issues that we need to learn to disagree more so than, say like where we want to have dinner tonight or something?
Yeah, right. Well, I mean, so some disagreement and some difference in the world is actually just good and interesting. It makes the world more fun, right? We have different sports teams that we back. We like different kinds of foods. We have different tastes and preferences. That's a kind of difference or disagreement in the world that's just fine. But when it comes to the issues that we care about deeply and that really matter, those disagreements are often painful. And that's where, I think of the title a little differently. The learning verb there is an ongoing verb that is never finished. So it's not so much that we don't know how to disagree as much as we will never fully figure it out. We just have to keep practicing for the rest of our lives. And it's an ongoing effort. And to varying degrees. Some people are more along the journey than others, but we've all got work to do in this area.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. One of the things that you highlight is the importance of empathy, patience, forgiveness with those that we don't disagree with. And, it's interesting because normally when we think about empathy and even forgiveness, like the idea of like needing to forgive, it almost implies, right, that there is this sense of hurt that comes when someone does disagree with us, as if there's like it's some kind of shot at us, or it says or implies something about us. And I know growing up, it was very difficult to learn how to disagree with my brothers and my sister and trying to figure out what that all means. And disagreements were one of the things, right, with friends. And so I tended to just kind of be the peace guy and at all costs, right, which wasn't really causing peace ultimately. And then I get married and my wife is like the opposite. And so like we have these like really interesting dynamics, and I could give you story after story. Talk to us a little bit about the place of empathy, patience, and forgiveness in disagreement. And even if you wanted to share a story that illustrates one of these ideas from the book, that would be awesome.
Yeah, I mean, so you can think of this in two ways. Sometimes it's like, and you all have probably experienced this in your own friendship as well, that the patience and the empathy is actually just figuring out more clearly what the other person believes and realizing that there's actually more common ground than you thought. And so that's where the listening and the patience comes in. Other times it's actually leading in the different direction. The more you listen, the more you understand, the more you realize how stark the differences are. And they're not, you heighten the stakes because you realize how different you are. And both of those, I think, are important, and both of those require a kind of empathy and understanding. The challenge with forgiveness is that can happen in all kinds of ways in our lives. Sometimes people really harm us deliberately. Other times, circumstances in life end up harming us. So forgiveness is often as much about what we do to reimagine our own engagement in the world than what someone else has done to us. But they all play into these very human kinds of relationships as we seek to understand each other better. And, you mentioned marriage. And so I've got a couple stories in the book of my own, growth areas in marriage. And I would say, like, as a predicate to all of these things, patience and understanding is just, in the first instance, seeing the human being across from you and not getting too impatient or caught up and just trying to get through a discussion or even an argument, but pausing and seeing this person in front of you. And so one of the stories I share in the book is when I was practicing law and billing my hours, and each hour mattered to the money that we made as a family. And in that time period, on one weekend morning, my wife and I got into an argument, and it took a long time to resolve, 3 or 4 hours. And at the end of that argument, after we'd finally reconciled and made up, I looked at her and I said, "Do you know how much money this argument just cost us?" Which was not the right thing to say in the moment. And, it certainly took away any kind of a trust or reconciliation we'd built up to that point over the course of that day. And to me, the illustration or the point of the story in the book is to say we have to slow down. We have to start with the kind of seeing the other human being across from us as a predicate to any of this engagement across difference, let alone, relating to people we care about.
That's really funny.
I'm going to use that line. Look at our combined worth per hour. Do you have any idea how much this has just cost us?
Yeah. There's a comedian, Mike Birbiglia, who has a scene where he's just like, what I should have said was nothing.
Yes,
yeah. What I did say
that works.
You'd be surprised. I'm curious if maybe we can kind of take an issue and maybe kind of have you help us think about working through this issue. And one issue that is most prevalent, and I think it's kind of a good combination between I don't know, say politics, religion, what have you, is the issue of like LGBTQ. So, we've had politicians, theologians that are on one side of the debate, like it's a nothing burger, and then we've had others that are on the other side that are like, this is the worst thing to happen to our faith, our religion, our country, whatever. So like, taking sort of those two issues and having people talk about them, like what sort of recommendations would you give to help sort of make sure that the conversation is productive, but but people have the conversation without necessarily wanting to kill each other.
Yeah, I mean, so a couple of sort of top level points on that one. The first thing I think is to slow down and just acknowledge that in an issue like this, there are very likely personal experiences wrapped up in the issue itself. So we're rarely just talking abstractly about this isn't like reading Plato or something, right? This is something that's very real and personal to a lot of people and their families and their friendships. And so to keep it at a emotional and human level, and not to forget about that. And the next step I would say is you've named an issue that contains lots of sub-issues. So I would want clarity about what sub-issue are we talking about? Is it the legal right to marry? Is it religious exemptions from non-discrimination laws? Is it the question of marriage within particular theological traditions? Is it, a state or local issue or a federal or national one? And all of these are going to have different inputs into the equation. They're going to have different facts and laws and norms and experiences and morals that wrap up into the question. And then people are going to have different views based on that amalgam of inputs, and they might be different based on what level we're talking about and what particular issue we're talking about. So one of the reasons I really like the example is, in the abstract, you start on social media with a stranger and you jump into this debate and you don't even really know what you're talking about, right? You just immediately go into some deeply held idea without actually getting to the specifics of an issue.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And that's a huge thing. One thing that I love that you said there was defining terms and how important it is to actually define terms and to get to where the other person really understands what we're actually talking about. So we're not arguing about two different things and thinking that we're arguing about the same thing. And another thing that you said was the personal attachment to it. And it is exceedingly difficult for any of us to take ourselves out, right? And abstract ourselves up to say, hey, let's think about this with indifference. Because if we were indifferent about it, we probably wouldn't be talking about it, to be quite honest, right? Like, these are things that matter to us. Like, I'm thinking about with the LGBTQ issue, right? So if I take it from the stance of a pastor who has, an evangelical white pastor, typical, let's say, right? I mean, that's what I am, right? In Virginia, right? So let's just say that, right? In the Bible Belt kind of thing. So you're there, and one of the things that starts coming up, and I know this because this is what was happening within me. It doesn't happen as much anymore, which I'm very thankful for. But this fear that if I give ground, then that ground that's going to be given is going to be used against me, and I'm going to be hurt by it. And so there's this fear, and there's this projection into the future about what this is going to mean, even if it's just, I'm so insignificant. I'm just one voice and one vote, whatever. But there's this fear that comes with it. How do we handle and work through our own internal feelings, right? When we're talking about this, and define the issue? Like, how do we do that when we're feeling heightened in these conversations?
I mean, if you're jumping into any hard conversation and your primary driver is fear, I think step one is get out of the conversation and do a reset, right? I mean, you're just not setting yourself up for success. I mean, that's also true if you're, jumping in hungry or tired, or, you in a hard conversation, you want to come in with a full tank. And if you're waylaid by a physical experience or an emotion that's overriding even your ability to jump into it, then I think, pause and come back another day. Let me give you an example though that I talk about later in the book, which is the Masterpiece Cake Shop case. And this is the gay couple that is getting married and the conservative evangelical baker who doesn't want to bake the cake for their wedding. And I raised that particular story because as that was coming up in the courts, I was following it because it's falls within the areas that I teach and write about. And watching the media coverage on both sides, there was just no sympathy for the other side, regardless of which it was. And people quickly forgot in the media channels that there were human beings attached to both sides of these issues. And there was a couple that was actually wanting to get married, and you could conceive was actually really hurt by the denial of the cake. And there was this baker who actually had religious beliefs and was really hurt by the requirement that he bake the cake. And the possibility of even the reality of those feelings was dismissed by both sides. And then you add onto that, this is a complex issue. It involved a Colorado state law and a federal free exercise of religion claim and lots of courts and law around that. And so, you might come in like from a broad perspective of I am worried about this issue or I'm fearful of this issue from one side or another. But that's just step one. And then to drill down into what are the specifics of this case, what are the policy and legal considerations, and how ought we think about that and work that out. And, this is just sort of one micro example of a broader set of issues. But you only get to that depth of conversation if you can overcome the initial emotional framework about a broader question.
Yeah, that's so insightful. I want to talk about fairness, if I could, and maybe sort of like your assessment of like what place the law has, in sort of this concept of fairness, kind of to your point about just, debating things about like the cake, and each side was very passionate about their reason for doing what they do. And I appreciate you using that example in your book, because I mean, we had Lucian Greaves on our show, he's the co-founder of the Satanic Temple. And we had him on to talk about religious liberty, right? Like when you hear the term religious liberty, most people are like, oh yeah, just Christians, like they're the ones kind of talking about it. But in his mind, it's like the obstacles that he was facing were all religious liberty issues as well. And he didn't think it was fair that, there couldn't be an after school program sponsored by the Satanic Temple or whatever. So in your mind, like what place does the law have in ensuring that, everyone is sort of treated equally?
Well, yeah, I mean, so to take both those examples, the one that we were just talking about and the one you just gave, what's fair is determined by what your baselines are. What's fair in one situation is going to feel very unfair to the person on the other side of that issue. And we don't get around underlying norms and values when we try to figure out what's fair. And in a diverse democracy where people have lots of disagreements, we're not going to reach a situation where everybody, thinks we've reached fairness and calls it a day. We're going to be having an ongoing conversation and set of arguments about what counts as fair and who gets to decide and how we frame that issue. And then once that's decided, at one point, we go back to the conversation and keep arguing about it. And I think one of the things that law does for us is helps us realize that we're never going to get there. And in a broader sense, the world is full of harms and wrongs and injustices, and those don't get righted in the day-to-day. It's not like we have something called justice that remedies completely injustice. So we're left with unfairness in the world and what to do about it. And the law gives us a vehicle to try for proximate justice and proximate fairness, but that's going to be incomplete, and that's going to leave people feeling like there's something still on the table.
Yeah, I love this conversation because I love thinking about the law and the First Amendment rights, our Bill of Rights, what that means for us. I think it's really important. It is deplorable is the word that comes to mind. I don't know if that's the right one, but the idea of how bad we really know, like how little we really know the law. Most American, like the average American, they wouldn't even be able to probably quote, 2 of the Bill of Rights. I mean, I'm just pulling that right out of a hat there, but I'm just saying it's like or they just choose one. They know the Second Amendment, but they, don't know the 13th. They've forgotten that one. And that's a really important one, right? And all these different things, like there's no sense of really what we're actually dealing with when it comes to the law. And that kind of moves to this problem of how do we figure out, like, when there is such ignorance and there's so dealing with the law in some ways is kind of abstract, right? Because it's kind of divorced from our normal reality until we have to face it, right? It's there, but until we get like a subpoena or someone has sued us or someone has done something, we don't typically even think about the law, right? So it's this kind of abstract thing. But what we do think about is when we've fought with our son or daughter, right? If we're a conservative Christian and we don't like the way that our now LGBTQ son or daughter or grandson or granddaughter has come out, and they don't want to be called a grandson or granddaughter anymore, or they might have changed their name, or they want something different, and they want you to pronounce them. They want you to ask a different, and I'm talking about real situations, right? That I know I'm facing, other people are facing, where they have a different name that they would like you to use, potentially different pronouns, right? And you're kind of left like, wait, what happened here? And I'm thinking about those situations. And I would love for you, like, walk me through, how do you even get to baseline in those situations where there's someone where what they're doing almost feels personal, even though it's not, but it feels personal. How do we work through those kinds of situations? Because I know as a pastor, we're facing this more and more and more and more and more, and we will continue to face it more. I read something just really quickly. I read something where from the, it was the PRRI. We interviewed someone from them, the Public Religion. It's an institute. I'm forgetting it. I'm sorry, but they basically research and it said 1 out of every 5, 22% of like people 18 to 30 identify as LGBTQ, which I was shocked by that statistic when I saw that. So my point is just that it's here and we have to work through it. So how do we get to baseline? How do we define terms? How do we even start this conversation with those
there's a lot in what you were saying there. I guess in a general sense, whenever you have a hard disagreement or difference with somebody, if you care about them in your life, then prioritize the relationship and figure out where your common ground is. I mean, a lot of us have lots of relationships with people who are very different in all kinds of ways. And we have those relationships in our life and they come fairly naturally to most of us. And then we have issues that we disagree about and we manage to function in the world with those differences. And I think that's applicable in this example as well. I mean, when it comes to something like a name change, I think most people are okay. Like if your kid gets married and changes their last name, you're usually okay going along with that, And so like if somebody in my life comes to me and says, I want to be called a different name, I don't really have a problem with that. I don't think I'm
that makes sense.
I'm not saying anything about the world other than what this person would like to be called. And in the pronoun sense, I just think that's usually pretty easily avoided. Don't use pronouns in the few times that you're going to talk to someone. And you can, there are ways to, language creates some challenges for us, but language also gives us ways out of some of those challenges. So I think I'm not just suggesting that these issues aren't hard. They're very hard in both directions, right? Interpersonally and otherwise, but there are ways to engage that I think don't always have to put everything on the table, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So as a law professor, I'd be curious to know, like, Have your students taught you anything about, how to disagree or, empathy or any of the sort of like subtopics that we've already been talking about?
Oh yeah, all the time. I mean, I think to me, one of the greatest upsides of classroom teaching is that it always keeps you on your toes, and each class is different. And over a period of years, the student generations change. So I learn new things all the time about how people come with different experiences. And I'm thinking back as you asked the question to people in my class who come from different backgrounds or who've been subjected to different parts of the law that I haven't had personal experience with. And I think learning about them and learning with them is constantly reshaping my understanding of things. I had a student a few years ago she came to law school because she successfully argued for the parole of her father, who had been in prison a long time for second-degree murder. And, we don't have a lot of students who come from families with parents convicted of murder. And so to have her in the classroom and being able to talk about that at a personal level was fundamentally reshaping of our experience that semester. And I learned a ton, and I think the other students did too.
Yeah, that's so cool. And, when we're disagreeing with someone, we hope ideally that it's a two-way street, right? That we're going to show empathy, they're going to show empathy, but what do you do in situations? How do you disagree well in situations where one side is actively trying to empathize, trying to understand, trying to get the other side, and the other side just says, well, thanks for your empathy, and then keeps going and has no reciprocity in that process? Are there limits to the empathy? Is there a time to stop the conversation, say, this doesn't seem like I'm being heard in this?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are practical limits. So, there's only so much time in the day. And if someone's not engaging back, that's one thing. I mean, there are also different relationships where there might be power asymmetries or active harms being perpetrated. And I don't think we're all just sort of called to hang in there at all costs. So sometimes you have to get out of a harmful or destructive situation. On a maybe more theological level, though, the way in which we engage is not conditioned on how people respond to it. So, we're not called to manifest the fruits of the Spirit only if people are nice to us, right? Or it's, we're not called to love only our friends. So I think as Christians, the stakes are a bit higher. And, even though you might have to step back temporarily from a relationship, you still have to engage and act in a certain way. And I think one of the real challenges in terms of the social witness of Christianity right now is there are lots of Christians who are not doing this at a very basic level, and that's disturbing.
Yeah, I'd love to get your commentary on, today's political discourse, and maybe like what effect you think or believe the like mainstream media, conservative media, liberal media, what have you, sort of has like plays on that. Because it's funny, like whenever I have a conversation with somebody that is, the polar opposite of where I'm at politically, they'll use terminology that I am aware that media personalities are using, or they'll use arguments that I know media personalities are using. And I'd love to kind of get your take on, what role does media have to play in all of this?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of a dumpster fire right now, right? So it's it's a problem. All of the structural and financial incentives are trending in one direction, and this is true of both mainstream media and also our own engagement on social media. There are still some good, reputable outlets out there, and I think it's important for people to to pay attention to those and try to support those when they can. But even at the best places, they're bleeding editors. They're cutting all kinds of people that used to make journalism really careful and really measured. And in place of that, we're seeing the partisan extremes that are coming up with their own vocabulary, their own narratives, their own stories, and that's not good. And it's shaping us in very fundamentally different ways. And I don't think there's a shortcut or a remedy to that other than minimizing it and being very deliberate on diversifying your own media sources. And there are some great tools out there to help you do that. But I think if, for listeners or other people who are stuck in one partisan echo chamber, it's just going to get worse. And especially with the more sophisticated algorithms and more online engagement that are coming down the road, there's not going to be a way to beat it.
So what, like, if you're advising a student, like, what kind of, and just that you're aware of or that are in your mind, what kind of tools would you say to use, right? So you diversify. So if you're just reading the New York Times, maybe you should read the Wall Street Journal, or you should look at, some different, more conservative outlets, read both sides, right? That takes a lot of time. So that's got to be someone who's like willing and has the time to do that. And I know that there's not necessarily any shortcuts, but there's some things that you can do while you're reading, or some tools that you had mentioned there are good tools. Are there any that you just know of that you would recommend off the top of your head?
Yeah, I mean, so I think this will differ for different people. Some people actually need to start reading because they're not paying any attention to this stuff, and other people need to cut way down on their input. So maybe a healthy middle ground for both sets of people is start by trying to get something once a day, right? Daily is useful to kind of figure out what's going on in the world, but you don't need to check 20 times a day or 50 times a day. So if your social media feeds are giving you breaking news every 15 minutes, figure out a way to turn off the alerts and do something differently. And,
are you listening, Will?
What's that?
I'm saying, Will, are you listening?
Never. I live for the breaking news stories.
Well, but here's the challenge, and you know this too, right? Breaking news is no longer actually breaking news. All it's doing is updating our own priors with more forceful exclamation points and updates that are not telling us anything new. And it's reinforcing our emotional investment in what's happening, which is exactly what the paid outlets want you to be doing with this stuff. There are great aggregators that can email you once a day, and that's not a bad place to start. And if you're looking for diversity in those views, find one center left and one center right and get an email a day from, say, the Dispatch on the right or the Atlantic center left. And that's a great place to start. There's an app called Common Ground that gives you different coverages from different partisan lenses about breaking news. And then I think very importantly, also tells you when left or right is not covering an issue. So it reveals blind spots in news coverage. Those are the kinds of things that are great tools. They're out there. They're free. Might as well start today.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So I want to just kind of dig into the idea of, when do you say let's agree to disagree? Like, at what point do you say, hey, we've talked about this, we've kind of exhausted this, we're exhausted by this, whatever it is. At what point do you say, hey, let's just agree to disagree? And then do you just avoid that topic altogether? Or do you just continue to kind of just, I don't know, what do you think?
Yeah, the first thing that comes to mind is I think that phrase itself has kind of been hijacked, and it usually sounds passive aggressive when people say it, right? So I would start by not using that phrase. Don't say let's just agree to disagree, because it'll often come across as we're done talking here, right? And actually that's not the goal. The goal is learning to disagree, which again is this ongoing effort at relationship that doesn't set it aside forever. So, I mean, one example that comes to mind as you ask the question is, for me, with an interfaith friendship, right? A friend who's a Muslim or a friend who's an atheist. We know what those disagreements are at some point in our friendship. It's not super helpful every day to remind each other that we have very different views about eternity and God.
Right.
But I also think it's useful to keep it on the table in the relationship and not pretend like this is some settled question that will never come up again. And so I think the healthiest interfaith friendships that I have are the ones where we're never completely forgetting about the differences, but we're not kind of raising them in our day-to-day because it's not super helpful to do that in the relationship.
And so is the majority of your writing, your book, your research really kind of focus on the one-on-one type of disagreements, or can they be extended to a broader group? Say for instance, like MAGA Republicans and Black Lives Matter. Like can you sort of take some of the same techniques and apply them to sort of large, very divisive groups and the things that they agree or disagree on?
Yeah, I mean, my own work is related with both of those that you mentioned, but I don't think it's necessarily just scaling up. So they're two very different things. I mean, this newest book is mostly focused on our individual relationships and what can you and I do in our ordinary friendships and encounters with difference. I don't think large scale social change happens without a lot of individual change in that way. So to me, the kind of the priority in the current moment is to focus on and help equip that individual change. At the institutional or more social level, though, I think the ways in which we engage across difference are just essential. And a lot of my own work and writing, I mentioned protest earlier, the right of assembly, the right to gather, the right to join a group of your choosing that ends up in very different groups existing in society. And the founders knew this. Madison called them factions. We hear about them throughout American history. They are necessarily destabilizing and they cause friction and they're hard to deal with, but they're all we've got in our society. And so we have to figure out how to negotiate across them. And so this is one area where the importance of civil liberties really comes into play. And, not just do we have individual rights to say free speech or free exercise of religion, but we need to allow for groups to exist on their own terms, to engage in dissent, to practice their own belief structures. And again, that's hard for us, right? Because the groups we don't think are true or the groups that we think are harmful, it's hard to see them with their own freedoms in society. But unless, this has to be sort of a mutual non-aggression pact. Unless we all agree to help each other and protect each other, then it becomes a power game. Whoever wins crushes the other side and hopes they stay in control. And that's no way to run a democracy.
Yeah. When you mention factions, are you referring to like the Federalist Papers 10 or something? Could you maybe expand on that a little bit? Because I think the audience would really benefit from hearing sort of what that means and kind of how Madison thought about factions within the U.S. political system.
Yeah. So, I mean, in Madison, I think is using the term both in terms of express political parties, but also just other groups as well. And so in Federalist Papers number 10, he's saying this is how we are in society. And these factions have to be addressed and managed because they create tension and instability, but they're not going away. And, so you can see this right from the founding of the country with political tensions between the Democratic Republican societies and other interest groups, later on in our history as suffragist groups and civil rights groups tried to challenge the status quo. These groups and these factions necessarily destabilize and create uncertainty, especially for the people in power, right? The people in power would rather not have the groups, but would rather just maintain the power. But the reason in a democracy and in a constitutional society, the reason we allow for dissent and disruption is that we haven't ever fully settled the question of how we're going to proceed as a nation. And we have to allow for those other voices to enter into the conversation. That leads to factions. That's hard, but it's all we've got.
Yeah, it's like I'm just reminded of it's the quote that if all men were angels, then no government would be necessary. But alas, that is not the case. right? And I think
or similarly, if democracy is the worst form of government except for all the others, right? So
yeah,
it's not perfect.
Yes, absolutely. And one of the things that's so important that we've talked a lot about, but we've kind of like moved around this issue and this word, but it's context. And one of the claims that you make is that it's possible to have a difficult, hard conversation with anyone, but context really matters. Can you kind of elaborate on that? Why is context so important when it comes to having these conversations?
I mean, yeah, part of it is that we're just not wired to argue all of the time or to engage in disagreement all of the time. Sometimes we just have to, share a meal or watch a movie together or go on a walk. And I think especially for people who are being trained online to, share their political views over and over again, that's we can kind of feel that that's a bit dehumanizing of ourselves in some ways, that we have to, there is a context for every kind of discussion or argument. A 300-person public lecture is very different than having coffee with a friend. And when you might choose to bring up an issue or engage in it, the relationships matter. If you're talking to someone who works for you or a younger person and you have a position of power, then it might not be the best time to assert your strident political views. And other times it might be completely appropriate to engage in a very raw and honest conversation with a peer or someone else. So always context matters, where we are, what we're talking about, to whom we're speaking.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. As we're kind of getting closer to the end, I would love to think about some practical strategies, that people can employ. Say they can hear this, they can say, hey, I'm interested in this. When we're going to encourage them, go pick up the book, read Learning to Disagree. But maybe you could kind of whet their appetite. What are some practical strategies that people can use, even taken away potentially from this, listening to this podcast, where they can go from here and understand that they can maybe remember this in the next time they're entering into a difficult conversation?
I think the main thing here is just the reminder for all of us that this takes practice. You can't pick up on this by reading a checklist or having a conversation. You've got to practice this over and over again. So one very practical way to implement some of the things we're talking about, rather than just sort of having a conversation, why don't you find 2 or 3 friends and together commit to having 5 meetings, and coming together with a topic or a book. It could be this book, it could be a different book, but having a set of questions and conversation points. Talk about them in the first meeting. Don't try to get to agreement. Just agree that you're coming back, and then go away for a while and reflect, do some more reading. And when you come back, you'll have better questions. You'll have built some more trust. And just by establishing that framework that says we're committed to meeting 5 times, you've opened up possibilities that wouldn't otherwise be there. I think a lot of people, when they think about these questions of disagreement, think I've got to go have that hard conversation. And then if it doesn't fit within the lunch hour or the appointed time, you're just left more frustrated than before. So if you can create space and importantly, time apart to reflect more deeply, you're raising the odds of better conversations and better disagreement.
That's great. One of the things that honestly has been a huge impact to me and a lifesaver is every Monday night, I try to have a conversation with brothers that my brothers in Christ, but friends, and we have very different views. Will comes on that call often, and we kind of throw some things out and we talk about it. And it has been unbelievably transformative for me to just be in those regular conversations. So I absolutely commend that to anybody to try to find the time. It's so necessary. It's so necessary to do this. And so I kind of have one last big question, and then I'll have a follow-up practical question on how people can follow and things like that and get involved. But we have a pretty diverse audience that listens to the podcast because of the diversity that Will and I have, and then the diversity of guests that we try to get on. We've been able to gain a fairly diverse audience politically and certainly in terms of people's religious beliefs and all of that. What do you feel like is that? What's the most important thing that you would want to say pertaining to the book with how you want it to impact, but even moving deeper in the sense of what do you want it to do? How do you want it to change and transform the people that read it? What do you think is most important for us in this next season that you're putting work towards?
I think, especially as we think about the seasons ahead of us, I would say actually just be modest in your goals. You're very unlikely to change someone's view or someone's vote in the next few months. So focus on the longer term relationship. And if you really care about both the people around you and also learning more about their beliefs and your own, then commit to longer term relationships. And then that attaches to a commitment to institutions. You're not going to sustain a whole lot of relationships over long periods of time without healthy institutions that form a framework and a structure for doing so. So do the work of investing in relationships and the work of investing in institutions.
That's good. And just could you define the institutions a little bit more for us? What do you mean when you say that?
Oh, yeah. I mean, anything from, like, if you care about politics, then get involved in political groups. If you care about religion, then invest in a church or a religious organization. If you care about organization, volunteer time in an educational institution or a library. But the kinds of messy human structures that take time and money and experience to pull off, but then provide for others the opportunity to do things together.
That's awesome. So how can people follow you and your work, and how can they get a copy of the book?
Yeah, thanks. So the book is available, all over Amazon and elsewhere. There's an audiobook too, which I read. That was a lot of fun. I also have a free weekly Substack newsletter called Some Assembly Required.
That's awesome. Well, folks, this has been John Inazu, and we appreciate you so much, John, for coming on. Thank you. We'll put a link to your book, Learning to Disagree, in the description notes. But thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks. Yeah, guys, great to talk to you. Thanks so much for the conversation.
Same, absolutely. And guys, thank you for joining us and listening and watching. And until next time, keep your conversations not right or left, but up. God bless you.